Welcome to Take 5 with Timothy. I'm your host, Rebecca Haas. I'm the Director of Community Engagement here with Pacific Opera, and I conceived of this show. This is our very first episode, and each episode, our founder and artistic director, Timothy Vernon, also renowned conductor, is going to share with us some insights into something he's passionate about in the arts. Now, I know that Timothy and I can talk for a long time about a number of topics, and so I set myself the goal that I would only ask him 5 questions so that we could actually make sure you weren't here for years watching us chatter. So we're going to have 5 questions, thus the name Take 5 with Timothy, and today's topic is teachers. So we're going to talk about teachers for conductors, which I think is a very specific thing. When many of us think of teachers, we'll think more of our grade school teacher, but for musicians, it's an entirely different relationship. And I'm going to posit that people don't really come out of the womb thinking they're going to be conductors, and that it's a very particular thing to be taught. So maybe you can even just tell me a little bit about what it is to be taught to conduct. What is that role of the teacher in the life of the conductor?
Well, of course, conducting is the end of a process, and despite the fact that there was a plethora of 7-year-olds doing Rossini or something online not too long ago, it's a very complicated thing, and waving your arms in the air for a living is a precarious business at best. It's probably much more important at the airport.
Probably.
Still. The formation of a musician, show me a musician who doesn't think constantly, I hope, of what he or she owes to the teachers that started him out. And often everybody goes back to their grade 1 teacher and remembers with fondness learning the alphabet or whatever it was. But those are fundamental things. And even very famous artists will recall teachers who may themselves be quite obscure, but who brought them to a point where they exercised their art. I know it may have some interest for me to quickly review how I emerged in Victoria, BC, because this is where I grew up. My first teacher that was significant for me was a woman named Nora Heimberger. She was actually Nora von Heimberger, and she was very German, and she was very strict, and she was a terrific pianist herself. She never had a career. I think there were psychological issues that I never understood. She was, however, and this is so interesting, the daughter of a countess who was a von Mendelssohn. So her mother was a von Mendelssohn, and the family had, and Nora showed me, rings stemming from Felix and Fanny and letters that were in the family still. And this was something I was far too young. We're talking I'm 7, going for lessons every Saturday. My father would give me 2 quarters, one for a hamburger and one for a milkshake. That dates it right there. And I would go down to Oak Bay. No, I would go down to Cook Street. It was the Cook Street Village, and have my lesson every Saturday. And I was devoted to Nora because she was insistent on standards and quality, and she understood something that I wanted to understand. That's, I think, the most important thing, is that your curiosity about what it is awakened. And that's something that she did in my rudimentary lessons, early learning to play the piano. I'll skip ahead a little bit because history plays an interesting role, and I'm talking about my personal experience, so please bear with me. I went to university early, I got through school early, blah, blah, and I went to UVic. I think it was the first year it was UVic. And they had a chorus, maybe it was the second year, and they were preparing to perform Bach's St. Matthew Passion with the Victoria Symphony. And just at the top of that season, a remarkable change had happened with the orchestra. They had engaged a man named Otto Werner Müller to be their music director. Now, he was almost 7 feet tall. He was huge. And of course, I only heard a little bit about him. I was busy at the university accompanying the chorus. Then the conductor got sick, and the kids went to the faculty and said, look, Vernon's already working. I had a church or 2 church jobs at the time. Let him continue with the prep. So I did. And I continued. How I did it, I have no idea. I don't know what I looked like. I didn't know what I was doing, but I got them to sing all those chorales and the choruses, and it was all fantastic. And then came the fateful day when Otto Werner Müller, the music director of the orchestra, was going to arrive and work with the orchestra, the chorus, for the first time. He came in the door, and everybody was like, because he was so tall and so imposing. And when he frowned, it was like the whole sky clouded over. And, he was an imposing figure. And he stood in front of the chorus with impeccable, clear technique, gave an upbeat to get them to sing a particular chorale, and they all just stood there with their mouth hanging open. And I was so humiliated, I didn't know what to do. I ran out, I jumped in my car, I ran home. I cried and cried and cried until later that night the phone rang, and it was Otto, and he wanted to come to the house, which was horrifying. Actually, I've got it out of sequence. He wanted me to go to his house, which was horrifying and
It's
scary.
like being called to the principal's office.
So that's, oh my God. So I did. He lived over in Oak Bay at the time, and I went over and had the most grueling, now I understand it's an audition. But at the time, it was like reading the same chorales I've been rehearsing, but in open score with 4 different clefs and history questions, theory questions, repertoire questions. Oh, unbelievable. And I staggered home just feeling, oh God, that's it. I'm not going to go into music at all. I'm going to do something else. But he phoned my parents and came over and persuaded them to let him take charge of me for a year. That was the bargain. Take him out of university, give him to me for a year, and we'll see where we go with this. Because I think he could be a conductor. And of course, there was no Conservatory of Music. It was the first year of the Victoria School of Music. And the very first class established in the school was a conducting class, which is so absurd. Because, of course, again, it's the end of everything. What do? There was no orchestra. There was crazy. But Otto had been a pupil of the great Russian, Igor Markevich. He'd worked with him in Russia, and then he came to Canada. He drove taxi for a while, played viola. He used to be a trumpet player, but that kind of went by the by. And then came this appointment through some mutual friends to the Victoria Symphony. It was an incredible time at the symphony because, of course, he would scare everybody to death. I remember the rows of little old ladies, pardon the expression, sitting in the back of the second violins, just crying such that their glasses would slip down their nose and they'd have to pick them up and stop, and he'd stop and yell. It was amazing. It was wonderful. It was, in a weird way, inspiring. But then it came time to do something to go the next step. Otto was German. And he thought of Vienna as this place of sloppiness. Schlamperei is the German word that Mahler used about Vienna himself. But there was a very famous teacher there for conductors, and this is unusual. The School of Conducting in Vienna started after the Second World War. 2 famous men, Clemens Krauss, who was Strauss's famous conductor, and then Hans Swarovski. And Hans Swarovski ran this school in what was the Akademie für Musik und Darstellende Kunst, so performing arts. It's now the University of Vienna. And he had a very famous class. By the time I went in 1965, which is 10 years after the Staatsvertrag, which is 10 years after the end of the war, he'd had a raft of very famous conductors, including Claudio Abbado, Zubin Mehta, you can name it. There's a long list. And getting in was tough, and it was an 8-year program, and it was, but I went nonetheless. I got a little bit sidetracked because in studying theory and preparing for exams and stuff, I became fascinated with composition. And so for a brief while, I thought of myself as a composer, and that conducting was maybe second rate and so on and so forth. Well, I found out after a little while that I wasn't a conductor because I didn't have to do it. I couldn't leave music, but I was perfectly happy not to compose. And that went against everything I believed, that, if Beethoven can't compose, he's going to die on the spot. That's how I felt about it. So I went to the conducting school. Swarovski was one of the great teachers. He was a complete pedagogue. He was not a great conductor himself, although he made several recordings, and there's now a sort of archive of what he himself did as a conductor. But his teaching was of a particular kind, exemplary of a particular kind. He was dogmatic and picky. He insisted that we know the score inside out. What are the notes on the page? And he would say, Meine Herren, gentlemen, between the notes is empty paper. So he was a stickler for knowing the score, understanding what it is, understanding the notation. That's already a puzzle to get through. And, indications of tempo and agogics and dynamics and everything, what do they all mean? We had to sweat to make sure that we understood exactly what it was. And he was very pointed in calling us out. There was a small orchestra in the academy at the time, and we had classes, believe it or not, conducting classes, actually getting up and conducting something 2 or 3 times a week, which was astonishing. For the rest, we sat in a class with him, opened the score, and analyzed it down to the ground. So his approach was extremely and profoundly intellectual. He had an enormous background. He had a degree in art history. His first wife, Knopfmacher, had been a pupil of Sigmund Freud. He understood the whole history of psychoanalysis. He knew 7 languages and had read everything in all of them. He was extraordinary. He had some sort of harsh edge too. Because he hadn't had the kind of career that maybe he thought he should have. And there were rumors when I was in Vienna that were fascinating. So he was born in Budapest, that much is sure. But the rumor went around that, his father was Otto Habsburg, not the one that survived, but the one that was crazy and used to run. He was kept up on the top floor of the Bristol Hotel, and he would run out naked through the Kärntnerstrasse, and they'd have to go and chase him and catch him and bring him back. And then he'd had an affair with an actress in the Burgtheater. And that's where the name Swarovski came from. And that's what, as students, we all believed. I've now read on Google that his mother was the daughter of a police inspector, and that, yes, he was born in Budapest. And there was obviously a lot of wealth, and probably a wealthy Jewish lawyer was behind the fact that he had an excellent youth, an excellent education. He drove one of the first chauffeur-driven cars in Vienna. So, I mean, there were means there. And he took full advantage. He went on to become close to Richard Strauss. And in fact, he became his amanuensis during the war. He lived with Strauss in Strauss's basement in Garmisch-Partenkirchen and would tell us these fantastic stories. And true or not true, they're still fantastic. That the SS or the Gestapo would arrive looking for Strauss's daughter-in-law, who was Jewish, with just papers and addresses, nothing. And they'd march up, and the minute they were seen or spotted, Swarovski would run down into the cellar in the basement and watch through a grate on the front walk. And the Gestapo would come to the door, and Strauss kept his order, because early on he'd been made Reichsmusikdirektor, a position he left pretty promptly, but he kept the insignia because it was useful. So he'd strap that on, open the door and say, "How can I help you? And do you know who I am?" And they'd all, and then he'd chase them away. Those are fantastic stories. And Swarovski worked his way into opera history forever with one single thing that he did. Strauss was writing his very last opera, Capriccio, and it's a discussion of words and music. And it's got every opera joke, all the trite jokes and some funny new ones about opera in it. It's fantastic. And the premise is this duchess wants to choose between 2 lovers, and one is a poet and one is a composer. So who wins, music or poetry? Together with Clemens Krauss, Strauss had been looking for the core piece, which would be a sonnet. And the deal would be the poet writes the sonnet and the composer is asked to set it to music. They couldn't find it. So Swarovski, with his huge knowledge of repertoire right through the Renaissance, literature right through the Renaissance, he found a sonnet by Ronsard, I think 12th, 13th century French poet. And he made a translation into impeccable German, quite literate German, not fussy, but beautiful. It was beautiful. And he brought it to Strauss, and Strauss read it and was completely enamored right away. And in fact, that very night went and sketched the tune to the sonnet, and later gave Hans Swarovski the autograph of this very first sketch of what is the core of his opera Capriccio. He taught for a long time. He conducted. He worked in various places. He was honored more or less as a great teacher, not so much as the Firebrand conductor, because that's not him. But he had concerts with the Vienna Philharmonic. He had performances in the Staatsoper. He was a stickler for interpretation, so he hated the way the opera business had become so sloppy, and that interpretations were so slovenly, and that they weren't brushed off, and that people took full advantage and made fermatas and all this stuff, that we know about. And he described going into the Director General's office upstairs and starting to talk and getting so mad that he took his arm and cleared the desk in one gesture, and all the inkwells and everything went flying. And I'm not sure that he conducted there again after that.
Maybe not.
But he was irascible and wonderful, and you know, whether you agreed with the way he steered you towards a certain interpretation, he certainly made you learn. He made you read. He made you look at scores in depth and detail. And he was the making of so many fine conductors, you know, in a longer period. So he was certainly a major influence. And after Otto Wiener-Müller, who had been so enormous and overwhelming, Otto had given me the basis of a stick technique. Swarovski didn't talk about it. He gave one lesson, you know, like floor, wall, ceiling, floor. That was sort of the basis.
Which is the thing that we actually think probably all the teaching would be about.
Floor, wall, ceiling. Otto had a fantastic technique, going back a little bit, starting with circles and doing this and getting everything small and precise, because his teacher, Markiewicz, I already mentioned, was famous for being able to conduct the rite of spring with one hand, with his arm stretched out. So none of this. It was all like, and the orchestra could follow everything, which is fantastic. So I came not with that level, but with that aspiration and some of that background and that discipline. And I'm glad I did, because Swarovski wouldn't have given you anything like that. And finally, the next big influence, and I don't want to be boring about this, but these are people that they just shine such strong lights in music in the 20th century and in my own life. So forgive me for...
Oh, I can feel their presence.
So Franco Ferrara is the name.
It's a great name.
It's a great name, and of course Ferrara, just like the city. But Franco Ferrara was Sicilian. He was born in Palermo in something like 1911. He was a young genius. He was a pianist extraordinaire. He was a violinist that could play anything. He became Toscanini's concertmaster. He played, you know, at the Santa Cecilia. He was its music director for some time in Rome. But he had an odd illness. It was like epilepsy. If he got too involved and too excited or too angry at a student, he would have a seizure. And his face, which you could see was mask-like. You know how sometimes sufferers from epilepsy get this kind of deadened feel in the face, and he would get that, and it was horrifying and terrifying, because it would usually come after a lot of yelling and sometimes running up and down the theater in Siena, which is where I went to study with him, and kicking the doors and kicking the stalls, and then he would fall down and twitch, and it was horrible. And you had to loosen the collars and get him some water and all of that. He was the complete opposite of Hans Swarovski. He was this dapper, vigorous, incredibly focused Sicilian who insisted not that we know everything that's in the score, but that we bring it alive, like now. And if there was anything that was sluggish or, you know, not on about what we were trying to do in the podium, out. And he was probably, as a performer, it was like getting close to a big, strong flame. He just burned with that passionate understanding of how things must go in the Italian kind of way, with all that elan, all that flair, and all that discipline, and all that rigor in his doing. It wasn't an intellectual exercise. And what he brought was astonishing. You know, he didn't conduct a lot because he couldn't. This affliction would overcome him. But there are recordings, he could do films because he could sight read the scores with a good orchestra. And so there's several recordings of him sight reading literally into the microphone with an orchestra, these scores, because he was so like, boom, fast. I remember him at parties, and there were few, not a lot, but he would come and he would have a drink or two, and then he'd sit at the piano, and he could play the entire repertoire from memory and sing all the parts. I remember him sitting and singing, Tal mio nome Sigmondo sono, Di Valkyrie, Act 1, in Italian, which was hysterical. Tal mio nome Sigmondo sono, ich bin Sigmund bin ich. Yeah, and he was somebody I revered, absolutely revered, as a musician. I understood I'm not Sicilian. I can't participate in that clear, pure ore that's there in that tradition, you know, something so intense and inimical, really. But he was so inspiring, and he was so, he brought everything you had in your mind, in your heart, in whatever you thought of your talent, into a focus. And I went back to him. I'd been ill for several years. I lost 3 years to illness while I was in Europe. So I didn't have any outlet. And by the time those years had passed, my friends had all gone into their careers, and I was there not knowing if I'd ever stand on a podium again. And I thought, I'll go back and do a course with Ferrara in Siena, because if I can do that, I'll survive. And I did. In fact, I went and did 2 more, and I also went to Hilversum in Holland. And the last course I took with him, not too long before he died, it was in Siena, which is, as everybody knows, this beautiful, essentially medieval city. It's so unlike Florence. Florence is this wide open, Renaissance place, and Siena is this dark and rather more closed. And it's the cathedral in Siena is the source of Wagner's inspiration for Parsifal, which gives it a certain place, and it's got an atmosphere. And the Campo, where they have the Paglia, the horse race, where somebody invariably gets killed, and it's awful. But in the theater at the bottom of the Palio, the bottom of the Campo, is where we had our classes and our performances, because at the end of the year there'd be a public performance as part of a festival in Siena. And I'm going to tell you that probably the most meaningful compliment I have ever received as a performer, as a conductor, was when at the end of a concert, and I was the last one on the roster, and there was a lot of fuss, and I actually was given a prize, which meant coming back. But Ferrara came up to me and gave me a quick embrace, and he said, "Ho sentito la tua anima." I heard your soul. So those things, they sustain you through a lot. And there was a lot after that, too. And there were still many years before Victoria and Pacific Opera. But those were the formative influences in terms of instruction and teaching, mentoring, and inspiration in my life as a conductor.
So now that you are in a position to be a mentor, a teacher, I know you've taught, I know that you mentor. It's a very rich experience you had, and I love that there's the side of the curiosity, but also the discipline, but also the fire. Like, there's so many elements. What do you try to bring forward to the students that you work with, to the young people who want to learn this craft?
Well, I try modestly, because I don't believe I can command the authority of the people that I've been talking about, but I do have my own experiences, and they're getting to be quite considerable, and I love to share them. I've always loved working with young musicians, because I always love the freshness. I always love the ambition. I love that open-heartedness. I love that dewiness that young people bring, even if they pretend to be jaded and and we're tired of rehearsing and we don't want to practice and blah, blah, blah. Essentially, if you can tap into that energy, there's nothing like it. And yes, professionals can maintain it, but I think although it's much different now because orchestras are younger and they benefit from this youthful reinvention, because so often the older orchestras, and I mean the older ones, which were the ones I grew up with as a younger student, they became jaded because the idea of being in an orchestra was less attractive. The fact that I was trained to be a soloist and I'm not, and it's not my fault. And so you get there's a lot of negativity inside an orchestra. It can get negative very fast, or it could. Nowadays, though, there's a very different thing. The orchestra's developed, in my opinion and experience, has developed much more a sense of team. The fact that we're in this together, we're going to support each other, we're not going to let our standards slip, we're not going to expose somebody we don't like, we're going to pull together and make this thing work, in a way. And so I think that's shifted in terms of orchestra culture. But I love sharing this, and I love the fact that the life I experienced, I understand it now, Vienna, the eternal Vienna, well, the Vienna I knew then is gone. It's not that Vienna anymore. And while it was a dirty city, it was a war still showing the signs of wear and tear from the war, and it had a darkness to it, both in its cleanliness as a city, but also in its spirit. There was a darkness because they hadn't begun to come to terms with what had happened in the last 2 decades or 3. And so, but the music was glorious because musicians were all stuck, and the Vienna Ensemble was world famous for the splendor of their collective achievement, not just a bunch of soloists, which they also were, but the fact that all their ensemble works were stunning. And fortunately, there's a good recording of much of this. So when I went there, I would say Vienna, post-war Vienna, dark, dirty, a little bit shambly, still coming to terms with, beginning to come to terms with its past, still feeling hard done by history, hard done by history, as being reduced to this little schrumpf of a nation compared to the vast empire that it had been, and very suddenly too. So now, I've been back many times now, it's a beautiful place, and you can visit there and you can get around and all that stuff, and they've cleaned it up. Oh my gosh, Rebecca, it looks like the top of a wedding cake. But is the music as glorious? I don't know. You know? I'm not going to say, of course. And it may be 50% my nostalgia. I'll give you that.
You were there at a very particular
But
time.
it was a very, very particular time. The number of great singers I got to hear, the number of great conductors with great orchestra. Vienna Philharmonic, come on, you know. I lived through the whole Bernstein decade when he arrived and conquered the Vienna Philharmonic and brought Mahler to Vienna. Can you imagine? I mean, when I arrived in Vienna, I was so Mahler obsessed, I was prepared to fall on my knees if anybody mentioned his name. This didn't happen because, of course, Mahler disappeared in 1939. And there were, you know, occasional performances, but he wasn't part of the repertoire at all. So there was a lot to figure out, a lot to come to terms with. Of course, as a young person, I feel I wasted a lot of my time, and that's the thing.
That's part of being young.
That's a part of being young. Exactly what Shaw said about wasted on the young. I feel I wasted time. I could have learned so much more. I could have absorbed so much more. I could have made myself more aware. It's been a lifetime of catch-up. And the same is true of the Italian tradition, which in Ferrara I found such a compelling exemplar, you know, it's amazing.
You had such strong mentors. I think my final question for you would be, if there's someone looking for a teacher or a mentor, what do you think they should be looking for when they're choosing who to align themselves with?
Well, there are several things that are involved, of course. Superficially, there's temperament. You either get on with somebody or you don't, or you're prepared to respect somebody, better said.
Yes.
Or you're not. And that idea of respect, it's had some erosion, let's face it. The other thing is to satisfy yourself that if you're an instrumentalist, you want to know that the person really understands up to a solo level what's required from the instrument. If
But
you're
as a
singer,
conductor.
Sorry?
As a conductor.
As a conductor, that's really tough.
That's why I say it's a very interesting field you're in, right? Because people did sort of pop into your life and somewhat accidentally, and then you did align yourself. But if you were going to send somebody out with a little piece of advice of this is what you need to look for, maybe alignment might be the. I wonder if it might be one of the best
alignment,
pieces.
that's true. But I still work with young conductors, and that's great. You know, our Giuseppe started with me at McGill in 1985. Oh my God, and we've been together ever since. But there's another fine young conductor named Jordan D'Souza who's working in Berlin. And he will still call me, and we'll have 3-hour sessions on the phone going over every bar of an opera that he hasn't done before. And he is the type of young conducting musician that I admire. He's not all flash. It's not about being photogenic, which he is. It's not about that. It's not about I've listened to this recording 100 times and memorized it by ear, but don't know which page I'm on in the score. He's serious, and he asks questions. He's endlessly curious.
This goes back to your first mentor.
I think that endless curiosity is the clue, as in so many things, not just music. But I look for a student who's curious, who's prepared to explore and accept direction and where to go, not necessarily do this or get out. That was Swarovski. This is the way it goes. If you want something else, go somewhere else. That was him, right? But I look for that. There's nothing wrong with a certain degree of dogmatism in a good teacher, because, you know, the propensity to rebel is strong anyway. But if you just insist, it gives the student a basis, a foundation. Later there'll be other growth and independence and personal things and so on and so forth. But you want somebody that will give you a thorough grounding on which you can build a life. That's the thing. So that's what I would say. conductors in Europe traditionally have had, it's different, it's always different. There's such an emphasis on who's the latest hot thing, and that's really, the online thing plays a lot into that. And the old school that I went to, it was a gradus ad parnassum. You knew you were at the bottom of this tall ladder with many rungs, and the famous conductors, they kind of distant at the top, lumbering like distant gods with a little bit of smoke and stuff. You know what I mean? And that you aspired that a lifetime later you might get, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's like, poof.
It's a bit of a different world.
But the old tradition was to go into an opera house. We come back to opera because opera really is what makes a conductor. A conductor that hasn't done or can't do opera, not interesting. Because they used to go into the opera house as a pianist coach. So they would play rehearsals and they'd accompany the chorus and they'd do all these things. And then if they got good enough, they were given a trial. And if the trial went well, then they might be given a few performances at the end of the season. And if that went well, then they might go to another house of a similar size and do something there. And gradually, because the unified Germany now, it has 88, I think, opera houses. So they have a system. We got what, 10? Oh, so they have a system and you can kind of climb it, And that's a way that I think makes for somebody with grounding, with experience. You want somebody to experience every level and not jump over things, not leave things unexamined, not make assumptions about what something is about. And it's a lifetime of learning things. It's a lifetime. Oh my gosh, I think how much I've learned. I've learned a lot talking with you, Rebecca, because you have strong insights into singing. You're a teacher and a coach, and you know what that is. And the way you think about your pupils and the way you think about working with people, that's instructive. I think it's terrific.
Well, thank you.
No, but I mean it. I'm not just giving you a compliment. It's the way it is in this business. If somebody sincerely brings something, that's an enormous gift. And it has enormous weight and enormous value. And we live in a world that may not always attach those weights of values. But I think we have to maintain their importance. Because what else,
I would agree. I think you have answered more than 5 questions. I didn't even get to ask my 5, but you certainly covered all of it. It was fascinating to hear about your mentors.
Thank you.
It is very inspiring. I think those are all important stories for all of us in music to hear. It is important. We stand on the history of all those people
Absolutely.
Who have, we've absorbed it in so many different ways. And I always think that this is an industry that really is not about the internet or about a book. It's about meeting someone who's engaged in the art form, and it's an osmosis. I think it's in your bones, and when I spend time with you, I receive so much as well, from even more than just our conversation. I think we carry all those people with us who came before.
That's true.
So it's a wonderful first episode for us because it's such a beautiful, deep topic, and I know both you and I feel very passionately about the mentors and the next generation.
That's true. That's
So-
absolutely true.
Thank you for sharing all those incredible insights. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us today in our very first episode of Take 5 with Timothy. And we've had an amazing journey here exploring teachers and mentors. And I'm sure we've sparked some memories for all of you who are watching of people who've meant a lot to you and sparked more stories. So I encourage you to go and share those with neighbors and friends because these are rich discussions and these people should be remembered and celebrated through our stories. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to our next episode when we will join you again. Thank you so much.